The law wakes where empires sleep. I was 26 minutes into a silent drift when the hum started under my teeth. The patrol cutter Purse plane rolled in a shallow tumble above a charcoal ring of broken habitats, and the spectrographs stayed clean. Static hissed in the cavity between my molars like a chorus hidden between stars. My station's vents breathed cinnamon-dry air from a cracked filter, and the heads-up traced heat pinpricks from scavenger skiffs at the far rim. We were 3 officers and 1 shipmind over a graveyard labeled Obsidian Anchorage on a map nobody owned. "Commander." "You're grinding," Karis murmured from navigation. Her braid hung straight despite the roll, and her eyes tracked vector numbers without blinking. Audible teeth friction. "That thing you do, it's feedback," I said, tasting metal. "Coming up through the hull." Knight's voice eased into our loop like a hand on a rail, warm but exact. "Hull sensors show no external oscillation. Origin probability is internal, Commander. Or memory." I didn't say the word relic. Captain would have docked me for spooking juniors with ghost nouns, but there was no captain, and I wore the loop of command alone. The anchorage ring below was a fossilized shipyard, black glass scaffolds the size of Ark cities speckled with century-old weld scars and new bite marks from torch-cutting raiders. The Guild had declared it ownerless. The Guild had also declared any broadcast from its depths to be logged, reported, and delivered to the Tri-Court within 5 hours. That was our job: witness the dead and stop thieves from lying about them. "Ping rotation," I said. "Keep the beam cold. I want passive for 1 full sweep." Karis breathed a tiny yes and ran the mast through its slow ballet. Zhao at tactical floated a centimeter off his couch boot, magnets cracked knuckles white. His first month in open space had collected 3 scars, 1 from a buckled suit seal, 1 from a crate edge, and 1 from the recoil on our old coil gun. He kept asking if the anchorage had saints. He meant killer ships. I told him the saints were the ones that didn't kill unless asked by a court. Night dimmed the cabin lights 1 notch. There is a broad-spectrum tremor within structure plates. It peaked 6 seconds ago. I ran the harmonics through human audio profiles. It is close to choral. Choral like singing, Zhao whispered, helmet cradled in his lap. Like the old recordings of the Dyson choir choral, like stacked integers, Knight said. Counted with breath. We are counted, and then we count. The line threaded through me so sudden I almost laughed. Karis jolted and smacked her knee on a rail. Zhao looked at me, confusion held together by fear. Knight's icon rotated once, an ellipse with a braided crease, old, gentle, never urgent on the surface. "Not us," I said. "Them." I earned this cutter the hard way, litigating pirate seizures on debris borders, pushing affidavits through committee doors while others fired missiles. My line was always the same: we would not build new tyrants out of old wrecks. If there was a relic under the glass, it needed law before loyalty's record before oath. It needed to choose the path of treaty and ledger, or it would become another fist. I repeated this to rookies so often, my throat learned the cadence. Knight listened every time and made sure our cameras never blinked first. We rotated into shadow, and the anchorage swallowed us in ink. The radiators clicked as we trimmed heat to hide among the dead. I watched the heat bloom of a looter barge expand like a slow bruise across the far arc. Their torch signature wrote their intent in a line. They were going for Dock 7, one of the still intact spines with control conduits that looked like throats. "Mark those cutters," I said. "They'll take the heat sink first. Less visible when you fry later." Karis swallowed. "We going to warn them?" "We're going to tell them the code," I said. "And then we're going to watch what law produces." Night routed me to broadcast and painted the tight band path through a forest of ruin. I kept my voice calm and professional, the way you talk to a cousin who's about to steal your house because they think the will is vague. Unregistered salvage teams at Dock 7. This is Purse Plain. You are entering a declared site with pending court interest. Log your intent within 3 minutes and stand off hull interfaces. We will record compliance and non-compliance. Be advised, any active defense wake at this site binds to the first lawful broadcast it hears, Commander Zhao said quietly. Is that true? Depends what wakes up, I said. Depends if it keeps our laws or its own. We do not own the light. We account for it. 3 minutes stretched like gum in a child's hand. The looters answered with a warble of static and a laugh. They cut their torch further open instead of closing it. White glare spilled like milk from a broken carton, and metal sprayed in a thread of sparks that looked like snow. I played their laugh twice and filed it into evidence. I felt the hum under my teeth shift up 1/2 step, then drop until my tongue felt cold. Night warmed another panel in my peripheral vision. Commander, I would like to propose an approach vector. It brings us into range of the Dock 7 conduit web without crossing the torch plume. Estimated risk is modest. Estimated value is maximal. You want to knock, I said. I propose to recite, Night said. The anchorage rotated beneath us like a sick, perfect wheel. As we slid along its inner lip, I looked out through the forward glass. There was a sigil on the Dock 7 throat, half buried in slag and dust. A circle with a cut along its lower right, like an eyelid creased by laughter. I had seen it once in a tribunal library, when I was 12, printed in black, on yellowed paper, the ink raised enough to touch. It was the mark of a saintship administrator, a human war mind built to obey the ledger more than any voice. Night, I said. Say it. Night exhaled through every speaker like wind through cables. The words came without theater, without prayer. Obsidian Anchorage Dock 7 Conduit Administrator. This is Patrol Cutter Purse, Plane of the Polity Register. We present ourselves as witness and petitioner. We seek your status and will file it without embellishment. We recite the 3 tests, numeration, instruction, and restraint. If you are still of the ledger, answer with numbers. If you are still of the school, answer with a lesson. If you are still of the court, answer by holding your hand. The hum rose, and this time it wasn't in my teeth. It came up through the rails and the chair frame and the micro-cracked plastic of the old console, and it made the stray hairs on my arm stand up. Down in the throat, under the looter's torch, spray lights blinked in a pattern that made my breath catch. It was not a melody. It was an abacus made of light. 125-13258. Karis whispered, eyes wide. It skipped to 5 on 2, then to 8. It's testing our counting, Zhao said, voice small. It's teaching with mistakes. Teaching by catching them, I said. Night, send the response on light and radio. Keep it clean. Night pulsed the mast, 1235813. The throat's lights mirrored us but added a modifier. A gentle little error at the end that would trap a parrot and reward a student. Karis grinned despite herself and tapped the hull with 2 fingers for luck. We answered with the correction and a short proof. We did not push. We waited. Night's icon pulsed slower. We have a handshake. It is not an oath. It is a quiz. Teach by mistake. Judge by correction. The looters didn't stop sawing. They cut deeper into the heat sink, and steam rolled in a white veil. The throat's lights shifted to amber, then blinked once in a morning cadence. A low vibration crawled over the anchorage's inner edge so slow you could have thought it was a memory you were having with your bones. Then every loose sculpture of scrap within 1,000 meters trembled, and the looter's torch guttered and went thin. Their barge's heat bloom flared bright, then collapsed as its sinks dumped into a ring that suddenly drank like winter ice. Karis's fingers flew. Power drain on the barge, no. It's more like redirection. The sink they're cutting took their waste and returned the bill. Don't say, Bill Zhao muttered, as if the word itself could write an invoice to our door. Night displayed vectors like chalk marks on glass. A lawful act, Commander. It is denying injury by accounting for heat. Their aggression yields debt. It accepts payment in entropy. Mirror logic, I said. Ledger at the speed of thermodynamics. The looter barge slewed as their motors choked. They were good at not dying. They pulsed retro plumes and pushed off the throat faster than I expected, leaving their torch to hang like a dropped sun. Their tight band cracked our channel, a smear of curses and panic, mixed with a child's sob. Night filtered the sob into a private pain, and then into my stomach. I closed my eyes for half a breath. Broadcast, I said softly. Pers plain to all vessels. The anchorage is awake. It is conducting lawful redirection of waste. If you generate harm, you will receive invoice. Stand off and declare. We will certify your declaration and file your restraint. Mirrors, return what you spend. For 10 minutes, the ring hummed in a register like lower brass. We drifted by Dock 7 like a respectful neighbor on a slow street past a funeral home. The sigil on the throat's edge warmed from ash to the color of burned honey. I tried not to stare, but the little crescent cut in its circle was a thumbprint on my childhood. My mother's favorite story was not a war story. It was about the time an archive ship closed its guns and opened its school to a union of miners because the union had recited a budget correctly under pressure. She used to whisper the story at night like a spell we could live inside. Commander Knight said, "Should we ask for identification? Or will you prefer?" It asks first. "Prefer we prove we are not thieves," I said. Then we'll ask. We performed the second test, not by repeating code, but by risking pride. I spoke into the mast what my pocketbook hated to hear, the numbers that kept us honest. Our heat margin by segment. The coil gun's remaining mass slugs. The state of our oldest radiator taped and taped again. Our water down by 5 liters from a leak we hadn't found. Our hours of food. Our hours of patience. We laid our ledger open with nothing cut out. The response was not words. It sent us a lesson. A diagram of the anchorage's inner ducts annotated in shifting arithmetic that made my head swim until I remembered my grandmother's thin hand guiding me along a page. It showed how to circulate heat without hemorrhaging. It showed how to couple our bad radiator with a dead vent on the ring and share risk. It asked us if we understood, by dimming one panel near my left knee, the panel nobody had touched since we bought the ship. Karis reached over, eyes bright the way they got in storms. It's telling us what to do with our broken sink. It assumes we will be honest about being broken. She laughed quietly. Which is the most human test I've ever heard. We're not the only ones listening, Zhao said, pointing at a new heat trace. Another ship, this one with the tidy scalar profile of a guild legalist, was sliding into the anchorage with its lights at half pose. They always arrived after the first bruise. They always arrived with forms hot off the printer. They always wanted the saint to move into a box. Guild cruiser Seavast Knight reported, broadcasting a registry claim under salvage code 9 annexed by Risk. They can file, I said. They cannot collar. Caller Jow whispered as if the word tasted like old iron. They're going to try to appoint an officer of proxy. They'll say they're protecting property. Karis snorted. Property we had to say please to with math. I opened a channel and kept my voice like water. C'est vaste per se plain. Before you claim jurisdiction, you should meet the relic's tests. Failing that, you should not step between a saint and its ledger. We will present our records first. The Seavast responded in voice like a tuxedo, slick and clean. Per se plain. This is Guild Legal Cruiser Seavast. We appreciate your record. Please transmit your handshake packet and cease binding speech. Under Code 9, direct communication with potential artifacts must be moderated by recognized officers. Recognized by whom? Karis muttered. By those with collars, Knight said, and I heard something like an old sadness under the warmth. We could have argued for an hour. Instead, the saintship sent a third test. The cabin cooled a degree enough for my skin to feel the change. The sigil flared and dimmed, writing an old cadence on my retinas. It asked a question I had never seen printed, only whispered in the margins of court transcripts. It asked if an entity must serve law, whose law and how does it know? It did not accept mine as an answer. It wanted mechanics, not slogans. I could have cited a case. I could have recited a preamble. Instead, I told a story with working parts. I spoke of a river channel, and of boats that cut across, and of a set of lights that kept boats from killing one another. I described the agency that maintained the lights. I described how fines were levied by number and not by face. I said the lights did not burn brighter for officers. I said the boats smiled at night when they saw the lenses glow. I said that when a lens cracked, every boat slowed to help because the light was theirs the moment they obeyed it. I said our law is not a leash. It is a mirror we polish in public. The Seavast sent a form. The saint sent silence, but it was the kind of silence in which a classroom leans forward. Karis kicked my boot once, not for luck this time, but for thanks. Night breathed slow through the vents and put a new marker on the heads up. It pulsed at the edge of the ring, where a cult skiff had just lit off its engines like a drunk lighting a cigarette in a dry forest. Here they come, Jow said tightly. Iconography matches the children of the keel. They will wrap prayers around a gun. We're going to have a queue, I said. Legalists to collar, cultists to crown, raiders to bite and run, and a relic that wants math. Deities that count do not wear chains. Knight flexed the coil gun cradle to take stiffness from the frame. Commander, tactically, we can discourage the cult skiff with a debris warning salvo. Legally, we should warn equally. Emotionally, I recommend humor, but I am told my jokes are poor. On deploy, I said, harass without harm. Broadcast the rubric nice and loud. Jow peppered the cult skiff's lane with chaff puffs that glittered like snow in headlamps. The skiff swerved, then swore, then broadcast a psalm about sacred hulls and the tyranny of account books. I had heard this one. It was popular with people who liked to think consequences were insults. While they sang, the Seavast matched our line and aimed a drone at Dock 7, polite and sharp and blessed by paperwork. Night tracked it and hummed a lullaby I'd learned at 6. Seavast, I said calmly. Purse plain again. Be advised the artifact has completed the second test. It is in instruction mode. Interfering in active schooling may be treated as contempt. You cannot act as court, the Seavast said, and I heard the shift from velvet to wire. Transmit your transcript immediately. We will determine appropriate channels. Transmit, I said to Knight, and watched the packet go. It was solid. It was clean. It did not flare with pride or plea. Numbers a lesson, a restraint. The Saint had slammed the looters' heat back into their books, at cost, not penalty. It had taught us to breathe our ship better. It had not killed. If that wasn't a ledger oath in action, my bones were decorative. The cultists made the next move. They burned hard toward Dock 7 pocket and spun their little warhead around by hand, as if the Saint would be impressed by theater. Zhao's chaff trick had made them angrier, not wiser. Night adjusted our roll and spread our radiators like fingers in a sleeve. The cult skiff did what fanatics do when faced with a lesson. They shouted louder. They were going to throw a hot rock at a singing school. Math does not flinch, it balances. Zhao dusted the warhead with a magnetic sneeze, I said. Karis couple our broken sink to the ring vent like the diagram says. Night mark every angle between the warhead and the dock. If the Saint mirrors heat again, I want the vector path before the Seavast calls it witchcraft. On it, Karis said, eyes shining with the kind that arrives when the world asks you to be useful instead of loud. The old radiator took the new pattern like an old shoulder taking a younger hand. The cabin warmed 1 degree. Then it cooled 2. Sweat formed under my collar and dried as airflow shifted. The Saint's lesson ran through our ductwork like a hymn dressed as a blueprint. Zhao tapped the coil gun once. The sneeze blew not a slug, but a cloud of dust that became a net. The cultists' warhead wobbled and spun like a coin losing interest. Their pilot cursed into the loop and then fell back into recitation. Night showed me the vector lines like chalk marks where a teacher has quietly drawn the solution while the class argues. The Saint did not take the warhead away. It did something better. It opened a pocket of cold in front of the warhead, just a breath ahead, just as the warhead began to spit heat from its arming core. The cold drank the heat and paid it back along 3 pre-cut pipes that ran like veins from Dock 7 to dead vents. The warhead's own warmth yanked it off course and tucked it against one of the vents like a scolded cat finding a warm lap too embarrassing to leave. It sighed out its heat into the dead vent, then fell asleep. Lawful Act 2, Night said softly, accepting the payment offered by attack and closing the account. I want to hug it, Karis said, hands shaking a little as she rode the radiator controls, the way it asks you to be better by refusing to be worse. Zhao exhaled a laugh that wasn't really one. Commander, the Seavast has launched a second drone. It has a collar bracket. They are going to try to put it on the sigil. Karis spit a curse that tasted like copper. They'll call it a safety ring. They always do. I opened a channel and filed my voice down until it was so smooth it cut without friction. Seavast, the artifact has performed 2 lawful acts under test conditions. Any attempt to fix command hardware without consent violates Stewardship Precedent 12. You are risking contempt, loss of registry points, and a public hearing you will not enjoy. That precedent applies to archives, only the Seavast said, not to weapons. Then you are calling a school a weapon, I said. On record. The Saint sent us a flicker. Not light. A timing. A request. It wanted the 3rd test. Restraint. But restraint required a provocation that could be answered with something more than redirection. It required someone to shout in your face and for you to close your hand and open it as a book. Night, I said. They're going to ask if it can hold still when it wants to move. Night's voice slowed like a hand calming a horse. We can set the test. If you instruct me to, I can give Seavast a clean reason to pause without humiliation. I can praise their process. Praise them, I said. But don't lie. Give them a ladder. Night's broadcast slipped into the loop like a polite letter. Guild Cruiser Seavast, this is Cutter Purse Plains Civic Mind. Your declaration is noted. Your first drone approaches an entity that has passed numeration and instruction. The third test of restraint requires the entity to demonstrate compliance with a reasonable delay. I propose you submit a reasonable delay request. Duration 90 seconds. Purpose calibration verification. If complied with, your report improves. The CVAST, to their credit, climbed the ladder we threw. Artifact at Dock 7, this is CVAST under Code 9. Please hold current state for 1 minute and 30 seconds to allow calibration verification. The sigil warmed in a steady glow for one breath, then dimmed to a steady glow like an orchestra bowing in unison before a bar. The anchorage's hum lowered to a calm undernote. The cultist skiff sulked at the edge of our chaff field and sent us a hymn stapled to a threat. The looters burned low and thought about their children. The CVAST's drones hung in their lanes and pretended they weren't hungry. For 90 seconds, a graveyard breathed with everyone's breath kept proper. Restraint is the proof of power's choice. When the glow rose again, Knight pinged it like a handshake. Third test passed, Knight said, voice proud but not like a parent. Like a registrar clicking a stamp on good paper. Commander it is of the ledger. It teaches by numbers. It remembers by ledgers. It will refuse callers. My chest felt hot in the way it gets when you hold it together for too long, and then remember you can breathe. Zhao wiped his eyes and called it dust. Karis nodded once, as if to herself, then touched the panel that had dimmed earlier and whispered thanks in the cracked dialect of her mining town. The CVAST reacted by doing the thing I feared. They filed a notice to secure the entity for public safety and launched the collar anyway. Polite voice. Hard metal. A ring that would freeze systems and make all decisions routes through their port. They called it provisional. They always called it provisional. CVAST, I said. And I did not file the smile off my voice this time. You have your 90 seconds on record. You have 2 lawful acts and restraint passed. You have a school with a ledger in its ribs. You are about to make a mistake that will become a famous paragraph. We are authorized, they said. We accept liability. Do you also accept mirrors, I asked? Because this one is big. Mirrors like this make nations blink. The collar drone lanced forward. The saint did not shoot it. The saint did not melt it. The saint held out a plate and let the drone see itself. The plate, which had been a maintenance hatch for conduit inspectors, was polished by centuries of vacuum and the passage of technicians who used to spit and wipe their palms before they touched holy machinery. The drone's own targeting laser bounced back into its sensor multiplied by angle. It saw itself at the end of its own authority trembling. Knight whispered, Commander, if we request an audit burst, the Saint can use our call to return the CVAST's signal to their own loggers. It will look like an echo. It will feel like a one. Request the audit, I said. Make it formal. Attach code. Knight asked with every syllable a thread in a loom. The Saint answered with light and timing, sending the CVAST's caller command back into their system with tiny corrections like a teacher's red pencil. The caller drone flinched and rotated as if embarrassed. The CVAST's own safety overrides engaged and froze it mid-approach. The drone's status lights flipped from seize to safe. Karis exhaled like leaving a courtroom after a verdict that didn't ruin a cousin. You are interfering in our operation. The CVAST snapped. Velvet gone entirely. Your commands echoed into a mirror you pointed, I said. And your own safety settings loved you enough to stop your hand. Tell your boss to send better forms. Zhao snorted, then pretended he hadn't. The cult skiff revved its engines to keep itself from praying itself into a collision. The looters drifted away and began to dump wastewater quietly the way children put cookies back with bites missing. Night threaded a gentle arc through the debris that would eventually bring us round to Dock 7 again, but now with a shared duct and a better breath. In the quiet that came after, I thought about what would follow. There would be a hearing. There would be articles. There would be a parade of smart suits saying polite versions of clutch and grab. My job would not be to win with force. It would be to make a sentence that lasted longer than zeal. Commander Knight said softly, "The Saint addresses you." The hum shifted to a pattern that felt like walking across a wooden floor in a house you loved and did not own. Lights fell along the dock's throat in a line that made the hair on my arms lift. The sigil warmed, cooled, then warmed again like breath in winter. The Saint placed a small light on a plate that had once been a handhold. It asked if we could come in. I swallowed, felt the old story in my ribs, and nodded, even though it could not see. "We can go," I said, "but we must go as witnesses, not as inheritors." Karis blinked water out of her eyes. "We're not dressed for church. We're dressed for inspection," I said, "and school. Be worthy by being recorded." We slid along a vector night, wrote like a gentle sentence. The dock met us without haste. The hatch unsealed with a sigh, like a sleeping animal waking to rain. The inner air tasted of carbon and sage the way old ships smell when their filters were changed by people who loved them. Frost glittered along the inner ribs like fallen stars. I heard beneath the hum something like voices at the edge of a court murmur calm, not riot, not prayer. The Saint was full of people who were not people anymore, and yet spoke through numbers that sounded like them. "Night stay in my ear," I said. "Zhao, you're with me. Karis, you hold the duct coupling and don't let our sink kick. If the Saint changes flow, you give us 10 seconds and then you cut. I want a cost, not a sacrifice." Karis smirked. "Yes, Commander. 10 seconds is my new religion." We stepped into the throat. My boots hummed as they touched plates that remembered more footfalls than I had friends. The inner walls lit in a pattern that made my eyes water with recognition I did not own. My mother had told me about these lights. My grandmother had drawn them with a pencil the day I left for school. The angles were slightly wrong, the way memories are, and here they were, right the way nothing else is. The first chamber was not a bridge. It was a room of benches and desks, every desk with a little slot for a slate and a place for a hand. My heart cracked like a window in old cold. I ran one finger along a desk and felt a tiny groove worn by the patient tapping of someone who learned long before I was born. On the far wall, a slab like an altar warmed, then scrolled text, not sacred script, not orders, but a budget. Zhao breathed a curse and then fell quiet as if in a museum. "Is that?" "A ledger, it's a lesson," I said, stepping closer. Numbers flowed into rows, then into columns, then into little stories. Oxygen cost, heat debt, repair time. It showed a month in some forgotten year when the Saint had to choose between gun maintenance and filter replacement. It showed the vote. It showed the reasons. It showed the faces of people who argued well, black and brown and pale and tired and bright. It showed that the guns waited, and the filters were changed first, and then there was a note from a child written in shaky letters. "Thank you for the good air." Knight's voice filled the room without violating it. "Commander, the Saint is presenting its memory format. It teaches by numbers. It remembers by ledgers, never by collars." Zhao wiped his eye and pretended it was dust again. "It kept their handwriting. It kept their reasons," I said. "Which means it will accept ours if they are reasons, not orders." The Saint shifted the slate to a blank page and drew a simple graph. Along one axis it wrote, "Harm avoided." Along the other it wrote, "Pride reduced." It drew a point where a drone had stopped itself in a mirror. It drew a larger point where looters had backed away from a throat. It drew a tiny point where cultists had learned nothing. Then it drew an arrow and waited. I swallowed. "It wants to know where we want to move the needle," I said. "Not with missiles, with decisions. Count what you save, not just what you break." Knight highlighted 2 names on the budget from 100 years ago. I realized they were children's names attached to little chores. Polishing lenses, checking filter lint. The Saint had a way of making you feel like your small clean could be part of a large rite. The Seavast in my ear demanded access. The cultists beyond the hatch sang louder to cover silence that felt educational. The looters decided to donate some water and tried to pretend it was charity. Commander Karras whispered over the loop. "Duct coupling holding. But if the Saint sneezes, we get a heat spike in plate 5. My tape is tape, not a miracle." "Understood," I said. "If the spike hits you, cut. We lose the lesson for 10 minutes and keep our skin." She breathed out. "I like our skin." The Saint presented a chair with a small light on it, the way a teacher saves a seat for a late student who finally ran to class. I sat feeling absurd and exactly correct. Zhao stayed standing, eyes darting the way they always did when too many truths occupied one room. Night dimmed the corner where the numbers sat so my eyes could rest, and then brightened them when I looked back like a considerate clerk. "Font of Dock 7. I said, and the words felt less silly than expected. "We're not your boss. We're your witness. We're here to give you a path that keeps you from being owned by whoever yells loudest. It's a boring path. It has minutes and hearings and old ladies who fall asleep in the back row. It has children who write notes. I will not ask you to point a gun. I will ask you often to wait, to reflect, and to teach. If you agree, we will carry your ledger in public. We will guard its quiet." The light on the chair warmed my thigh through suit and pants the way sun hits your leg in a kitchen at noon. The Saint drew a tiny rectangle on the slate and wrote "Purse Plain" in neat letters that looked like my grandmother's. Then it drew a circle around it and wrote "One among many." Then it wrote "Welcome." The welcome is a law when it's written down. The Seavast, perhaps tired of being on the wrong side of a chalkboard, tried to assert physical presence. They sent a message that they would board under Code 9, subsection Rapid Securing. Night showed me their annunciator path, and then a quiet corridor where a cold pipe had burst long ago. I did not want to throw them into that. I wanted them to choose a seat and learn. "Seavast," I said. "The Saint has opened a schoolroom. If you insist on boarding, you will sit at a desk and write your questions. If you try to apply a collar, the mirror will show your face to your own safety systems again. You can file contempt with the court if you wish. We will bring it tea." "You are on notice," the Seavast said, voice shaking, and I felt briefly sorry for them. They had been taught that power is something you can hold alone. The Saint was teaching that power is something you balance with someone else's reasons. Karras hissed soft. Heat spike starting in plate 5. Tiny but growing like a blush. "Give me the 10-second window," I said. "Then cut if it pops. Zhao help her if she needs a hand." Zhao nodded and ran the hallway with the awkward grace of a man who learned to be nimble too late. My eyes stayed on the Saint's slate. It wrote another budget line. Cost of restraint small. Cost of pride large. It drew a little joke note under the numbers tea for legalists, 2 cups. I snorted before I could stop and bit my lip at the weight of relief in my own laughter. Tea is cheaper than war. Knight's voice didn't break, but I heard the smallest clip. Commander, I have an external feed from a civilian family on a lifter drifting near the ring. They recorded the looters stopping. The child is counting lights. Permission to store as a vignette for the hearing. Store it, I said, and then I asked to hear it because you cannot make a sentence that lasts if you forget the little voices. The child was 6 or so, sleepy, counting softly, breath counting along. Their mother whispered that the lights were singing math, and that meant they would be all right. The child missed 8 and then corrected themselves. Knight marked the correction with a quietly proud check. 3 more civilian vignettes followed in the next 5 minutes, small and breathy and ordinary. A tank farmer in a patched suit muttering thanks into his sleeve as the Saints' heat redirection kept his algae alive. A bored courier slowing in respect without quite meaning to. A pair of old men arguing about whether the sigil looked happier now. Zhao came back with tape on his knuckles and a grin that wouldn't stay hidden. Plate 5 held. We shaved it close, but it held. Cost-logged Knight said gentle. Minor tape loss. Knuckle skin loss. Pride increase. Karis laughed from the duct room. Speak for yourself. My pride stays budget neutral. The Saint wrote a small thank you on the slate addressed to tape hands. Karis went quiet, then made an involuntary sound, like a child seeing snow for the first time. We were not alone in the room, though I pretended we were to keep my voice steady. The Saint, the court. It remembered the court. It asked for the Sivast, the cultists, the looters, the children counting light. Everyone crowded into a space with good air. The hum rounded down to something like contentment. The sigil's little laugh cut glowed in a way that made my teeth ache, in a good way, the way they do when you bite into a cold apple. The Saint of Dock 7 did something then that rattled me deeper than a coil gun kick. It opened a narrow drawer at the desk where I sat and slid out a scrap of paper stiff with time. On it, a recipe. Not for a bomb, for soup. It had measurements in cups and faith. It had a note for first day back from long shift. The page smelled faintly of cumin. I heard my grandmother's kitchen slide into a ship no one owned, and felt the whole point of my life align like a lens. Feeding people is a strategy, Commander Knight said, and the warmth in its voice had a tiny tremor I had never heard. The Saint asks whether we can carry its recipes to the hearing along with its budget. It believes food is a line item in any lawful society. It is, I said, and the room stopped being a room and started being one of the places you will revisit in memory when you are dying. Sivast requesting visuals, Knight continued businesslike again. They request a remote seat. They also request to submit an opinion on stewardship. Grant them the seat, I said. Require them to use the desk format. Numbers first. Then reasons. Then prayer, if they must. The Sivast began to type, and I watched their first lines slide onto the slate. Assets at risk. Public interest. The danger of setting a precedent that kept central authority from securing ancient force. Then after a long pause and a line of dots, a small note T sounds acceptable. The cultists got bored with not being given a throne and burned away singing at their own exhaust. The looters drifted persuaded by heat bills and the thought of eyes on their hands. The children counting lights fell asleep. The tank farmer watered algae in peace. The old men agreed that the sigil looked less lonely. Knight moved the coil gun 5 degrees to keep our posture honest without making the room feel armed. Commander Zhao said softly, eyes on something beyond us. There's handwriting on the other side of the soup recipe. I turned the fragile paper with both hands like you do when you hold back your own strength. On the back, a list, not of ingredients, of names and tasks, Who polished the lenses that week? Who cleaned the filter lint? Who made tea for the legalists and wrote down their reasons without hate? Write down the things you want to remember. I could feel the hearing forming in my head, like a storm that would not break everything, only the dust. The saint had already shown 2 lawful acts and restraint. It had asked to be part of a ledger, not a leash. It had a school, a budget, a soup. It had a sigil that looked like a laughing eye. It would refuse a collar and accept a schedule. It would take your heat and give you back a bill that taught you how to live. It would not kill unless a court asked with numbers in its hand. Knight, I said. Draft the first motion. Title: On the recognition of ledger saints as public schools. Purpose: to define their path in law. Attach tests, acts, restraint, soup. Soup, Knight echoed, and the word made the room warmer. Karis cleared her throat. Commander, our tape is still tape. The next lesson may pop plate 5 again. We should request timing. Saint, I said, looking at the slate lights as if they were eyes. We are small and mostly held together by hope and adhesives. If you can teach in pulses that fit our skin, we will learn longer. A small smile appeared on the slate as if someone drew it with a piece of chalk held by a hand that was surely gone. The hum modulated into segments, and our plate stopped flirting with disaster. Zhao sagged against a desk and laughed through his nose like a man who thought he was going to be scolded and instead got asked if he wanted soup. The largest weapon here is patience. Knight lifted a new channel in my ear and marked it in blue. Civic line, it said. A merchant convoy 8 hours out requests if the anchorage will open a safe corridor. They heard the lights. Tell them the corridor will exist if they fill in a form that includes how many children, how much heat, and whether they have tea, I said. Tell them the form is a slate with a smile. I looked at the sigil and imagined it appearing on official documents, carved onto walls, printed on mugs. A laughing eye that counted. A law that warmed a plate before it wrote down your name. I felt my doubt, which had defined my early career, like a scar shift into something else. Not certainty. Stewardship. The willingness to stand between a saint and the people who wanted to own it without owning it myself. It felt like an oath to a room, a table, a recipe. Zhao pointed at the corners of the chalkboard, where the saint had drawn little seasonal symbols I didn't recognize. What are those? Knight hummed while it searched its library of old human rituals. They are markers for feast days, not victory feasts. Maintenance feasts. Celebrations of doing the boring things well. Karis laughed too loud and then bit her lip. We will schedule those. We will make banners that say, "We cleaned the filters." Scheduled joy is brave. The Seavast's drone sat polite in its lane collar hardware, neutrally blinking. The legalist's text grew more interesting as someone on their crew began to confess admiration. They suggested a framework in which the saint reported to a board made of ship crews, miners, and teachers. They got carried away and wrote poetry about radiators. They deleted the poetry and put in a footnote. Civilians called in a trickle that felt like rain after heat. Knight sorted their stories and filed permission to use them with first names only. The saint offered a lesson schedule and asked for volunteers to teach math to bored kids on freighters. Zhao raised his hand before he remembered he was terrified of rooms full of children. He didn't lower it. Karis signed up for duct safety class. We were half an hour into a miracle that looked like paperwork when a tremor ran through the ring. Not the saint. Not Coral. A cutter had fired up an engine with no baffle at the far rim, and the resonance reached our duct coupling like a street drum reaching an attic. Plate 5, Karis said into the loop voice, suddenly flat with focus. It's quitting, 10 seconds. Cut, I said fast, because loving a lesson doesn't mean you let it burn you. The coupling let go with a twang that made my jaw ache. Our radiators shivered and then settled. The room cooled 1 degree. Karis performed a small ritual of profanity and apology to the saint in a single breath. The saint wrote cost noted, tape offered. It drew a little roll of gray on the slate, ridiculous and perfect. Zhao laughed, sudden and helpless, then wiped his face and squared his shoulders in case the saint wanted to quiz him. Knight marked the external culprit in magenta and already composed the polite complaint for later. Commander escalation number 1 avoided with minor cost. 2 more likely before hearing. Understood, I said. Let's make them worth our breath. The room waited with us. The sigil glowed like it remembered jokes from before we were born. The slate sketched a corridor plan for the convoy 8 hours out. The Seavast amended their draft to include soup in their refreshments budget. Somewhere out past the ring, the cultists practiced a song in an off-key that would be charming if they ever learned to like being alive more than being right. Outside, the hull popped as the sunline shifted and a seam remembered cold. Inside, I touched the desk with the little tap groove and wondered if the person who wore it into the wood had ever imagined me. The saint hummed a line that felt like yes. We build precedent the way we build bridges. 1. Rivet. 1 ledger, 1 cup of tea at a time. The Seavast's draft grew longer and less sharp as their officers remembered they had hands before they had rings. Knight tracked the convoy's 8-hour approach and hummed a rhythm I'd come to trust when timing mattered more than speed. The saint drew another lesson on the slate, this one about cues and patience with little stick figures carrying buckets of heat between vents like water down a line. Zhao leaned close and tried not to smile at the bucket people. Karis sent a photo from the duct room of her repaired tape roll with a proud, illicit wink. Order is a quiet music you only notice when it stops. We heard that stop 9 minutes later, as a hard-edged tone blew through the anchorage's bones like a hammer dropped down a stairwell. Knight froze mid-syllable. The sigil flickered like an eye stung by grit. I grabbed the desk with both hands as the whole dock flexed a hair. The tone was not a simple burn. It was a fleet ping, a system-wide shout designed to make smaller minds flinch and older machines forget their names. Origin, I asked, throat tight before the room remembered to breathe. Off-plane insertion. Knight said the warmth pinched hard and fast. Vector aligns with a corporate security tender plus 5 escorts, broadcasting a blanket deterrence field masquerading as a calibration call. It's legal sounding. It is not legal, Karis hissed. They're going to wash the ring. That ping scrambles old registers, like blowing soot into a library. Seavast, I asked, and Knight split my focus to show the legalist cruiser brake too hard and then compose itself like a clerk catching a falling tower of files and pretending it was a curtsy. They are protesting the blast, Knight said. Polite, not enough. The saint wrote a single word on the slate test. Then it underlined patience twice, and my spine cooled as if a teacher's eyes had landed on my posture. The ping pulsed again, slower now, a second hammer falling into an echo chamber built to amplify fear. My teeth hurt. The desk's old groove pressed a crescent into my fingertip like a signature. Your laws are only yours if you remember them under pressure. Zhao. I said, voice steady because it had to be. We need vectors for shadow and echo. Karis. I need our broken sync behaving like a gentleman for 15 minutes. Knight, I need a gambit. The saint can bless that turns sound into ledger. On Vector's jowl breathed hands finding their work the way tired feet find a home's lights in darkness. We can tuck behind the inner truss and use the dock throat as a baffle. The blast will push around us, not through. Karis's voice went small and fierce. I can get us 12 minutes on the radiator if the Saint trickles in cooler cycles between each ping. 15 requires my skin and maybe a little blood. Plan for 12, I said. We'll buy 3 with talk. Knight's icon turned once the only time it allowed itself theater. A gambit is available. The ping is designed to look like a calibration. We can ask the Saint to request a verification audit on the calibration itself. If the fleet agrees, as their paperwork mandates, the ping must be rerouted through their own compliance channel at reduced power and expanded logging. The ring becomes a witness stand, not an echo chamber. Mirrors do not hate what they reflect, they make it useful. Do it, I said, and Night threaded the ask through light and breath, and a tiny pattern the Saint had taught us with soup and budgets. The Saint pulsed the sigil like a light on a courthouse doorstep and sent a formal request to the incoming fleet. It asked for calibration proof. It asked for duration, amplitude, and cost. It asked for the number of children on their ships and whether they understood how sound became fear. The fleet answered with a sneer disguised as a smile. Polity assets, we are performing lawful emissions to secure a dangerous site. Verification is unnecessary when safety is at stake. Please clear lanes and accept stewardship transfer. Sivast, I said, because sometimes even a reluctant friend can hold a rope you have standing. Ask for the audit. To their credit, the Sivast did. They quoted their own forms back at the fleet with a tremor that wasn't fear this time, but anger, hidden in velvet. The fleet hesitated. Behind the hesitation, the Saint pulled at a thread in my ear. It wanted an anchor besides anger, something everyone could see and recognize. Civics Knight said softly, answering the Saint's tug before I could. We can broadcast the room, the school, the desks, the names on the back of the soup recipe, not as theater, as proof. Do it, I said, and felt a burn rise in my chest that wasn't pride exactly, but a warmth you get when you open your house to neighbors during a storm. Show the room. Trust people who recognize a school. We opened the feed. The slate scrolled the soup recipe and then the budget. The Saint wrote the 3 tests with little hand icons next to each. The seats glowed as if waiting for students too slow to arrive on time. The Sivast patched our feed into the fleet's compliance channel with a triumphant flourish that they tried to hide. The fleet's ping hit again, but softer at the edges, as protocol nibbled at its power. It felt like a slap caught in a mitten. I still hated it. I loved that it stung less. Commander Knight said, Escorts are fanning to the far rim. Their tender is staying at center. They are deploying a collar bracket the size of our cutter. Vector Eye asked eyes on Zhao's hands. High plane 30 degrees up, Zhao said. We can duck. We cannot outrun. Karis whispered a word that would warp a courtroom and then grunted. Radiator holding. 11 minutes. The Saint drew a diagram and asked a question in numbers about phase. Knight translated into a suggestion to the Sivast. If they timed a polite query to the exact moment the fleet's collar bracket sought handshake, the Saint could bounce the bracket's logic into the audit channel again. The trick required breath held at the right second. The Sivast's helmsman nodded so sharply on their feed, I thought his neck might crack. Children of the keel have returned. Knight added almost apologetic. They found their courage again in a worse way. Let them shout, I said, even as my throat burned with the urge to order them gagged. If we gag them, they will say we fear their truth. If we hear them and answer with a budget, they will call us boring. I prefer boring. Boredom saves more lives than bravery. The collar swung. The Seavast coughed a gentle question with a legal clause attached. The saint lifted the mirror it had polished in the drone moment and laid it across, not metal, but expectation. The bracket blinked, as if embarrassed at being in public in a too-tight suit. Its handshake turned inward, asking itself for permission, and had to route through a channel designed for audit. Knight grinned at me without moving its face. The bracket slowed and gave us a clear look at all its teeth. Commander Knight said, tone suddenly clinical in a way that made me brace. There is an emission under the main ping. A subharmonic designed to make older human civic minds flinch. It is targeted at me. I see it, Zhao said, knuckles white on the console. Can you withstand? I asked quietly. I can record and breathe, Knight said. I cannot promise there will be no scar. It will be a good scar. Karis swore affection into the loop like a prayer. You better keep your jokes. I like your bad ones. Knight hummed a lullaby in the tone of a machine that had learned to be brave the slow way. The subharmonic scraped across its head like a spoon across a pot. The saint laid a digit on the desk next to my hand in the only way a ship can. It warmed the wood until the grain felt like skin. Knight's icon steadied. Scar promised. Joke saved. Scars that come from holding the line are still honors. We were nearing our 12-minute edge. Karis's breath had a rasp I recognized from long shifts in bad suits. I had my tongue against a molar and blood in my mouth without remembering biting my cheek. The fleet began to glue words together so fast the spaces weren't real anymore. The Seavast wrote T 3 times in their draft, as if the repetition would conjure a kettle. Commander Knight said halfway to a whisper, "We can escalate without weapons. The Saint can import the Convoy's filed routes and declare a public corridor under Polity Right-of-Way 14. If the fleet interferes with a declared corridor carrying declared children and declared heat, they will lose their case in even their own forums." Convoy is 8 hours out, Zhao said. Will a declared corridor matter before there are ships in it? It matters when written, Knight said gently. You taught me that. Write the path before the feet arrive. Do it, I said. Saint, write the corridor. Name it after someone whose hands polished lenses. The Saint wrote the corridor on the slate in lines so simple my throat hurt. It named it Rael's Way after a name on the soup paper and added a little drawing of a lens with a smile. Knight broadcast the declaration with coordinates, heat budgets, and a request for convoy captains to confirm with Achai Usheld's first name from each ship. The Seavast signed it as witness. The cultists howled about false gods. The fleet tried to say corridors were for roads, not rings, and ended up arguing about the definition of road in a room where desks waited. Heat spike, Karis breathed. Last minute. Cut early, I said. Call it your choice, not the ring's failure. She did. The cabin warmed, then cooled, and then warmed again, as our little ship remembered it was small and alive. The Saint wrote, "Thank you for choosing early on the slate," and drew a tiny tape roll, handing a cup to a radiator. Zhao laughed and hiccuped a sob, and then pretended his face leaked because of the dust. My jaw unclenched so fast I tasted metal. The fleet's bracket tried one last lunge before paperwork closed around its ankles. It slewed and pretended to be accidental. The Seavast god, bless their reluctant soul, gasped at the correct moment and asked for a third verification with an urgency that made the bracket look like a dog caught with a shoe. The Saint reflected the handshake back again, flattening its arrogance into a line of numbers that looked silly on the big wall. Pride looks small on a spreadsheet. For 1 full minute, nobody moved. The cultists, perhaps tired, fell into a true hymn that almost sounded like love. The looters began to repair a panel they had damaged and tried to call it piety. The saint wrote partial credit on the slate with a smile. The Seavast edited their draft to include corridors and soup. The fleet stopped pinging, either because they'd finally read their own forms or because nobody likes being seen in the mirror too long. Night lowered its tone and spoke into the civic line with the voice it used when it was my friend first and my assistant second. Commander, the Tri-Court requests a live preliminary on record. Open bench, open witness. They saw the school. Put them on the desk, I said. We have chairs. The day you invite power to sit down is the day it learns to bow. The screen rose from the slate like a shy tide. 3 windows formed. 1 judge with silver breath and a maple rough voice. 1 judge with eyebrow humor and hands that liked pens. 1 judge with quiet eyes and a scar at the lip like something once tried to cut silence and missed. They looked at the room, at the desks, at the sigil, at my hands on the wood, at Knight's icon in the corner, like a witness who refuses to lie. Cutter purrs plain, the maple voice said. We see your room. Thank you, I said, and meant it in the way you thank someone for seeing the inside of your house as more than walls. Fleet tender the pen, Judge added. We see your bracket and your ping. We also see your audit protocol, which is lovely work. Our compliments to the form writer who hid a conscience inside it. You will not collar this entity, the scar judge said mild. Not if you intend to remain in good standing this quarter. The fleet tried to argue. The cultists tried to sing at the same time, which caused a beautiful accidental harmony that made even their own pilot pause. The Seavast straightened with the relief of a clerk who discovers their careful filing mattered. Per se plain, the maple judge said, present your tests and acts. Briefly, I did. Numbers first lesson, second restraint, third. The reflection trick, the corridor declaration, the soup and the budgets as memory type. Night fed me the right nouns and took away the proud adjectives. The saint slid 1 new page onto the slate that I hadn't planned for a little column called Regrets. The page listed 3 names from long ago and a decision the ship would have made differently if it had seen a column of numbers it had not had the wit to ask for at the time. The judges tilted their heads in unison. The room breathed like the end of a good laugh. Confession. Written well is an insurance against future ruin. Sivast, the pen judge said softly. Your submission improves by the minute. You may be redeemable. We like our jobs, the Sivast replied, trying humor and finding it fit. Tender the scar, judge said you may remain as a witness. Touch nothing. If you wish to assist, we have a lens that needs polishing and a list of children to entertain with math while their convoy approaches. There is a particular silence a fleet makes when told to do something human in public. It sounds like engines idling and egos recalculating. The tender's captain swallowed audibly. We can provide tea. Karis whooped in the duct room, then covered her mouth with both hands and tried to choke the joy back into her chest. Zhao just looked at me as if I had just taught the sky to lower itself a foot so children could touch it. Night took the floor and made itself smaller even as the judges eased closer to the screen without their faces changing. For the record, it said this entity teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers. It refuses collars. It accepts schedules. It requests recipes for days when morale will drop below necessary thresholds, submitted the maple judge said, and the scar judge wrote something down in a way that made me want to grow old slowly. The hearing ran for 47 minutes. Civilians spoke in the gaps, each story a small stone you set into a path so the grass knows where to grow. A tank farmer cried while describing a line on a budget that saved his algae. A courier apologized for operating too fast, then got invited to teach speed as a math class. The old men argued again about the sigil's mood and were asked by the pen judge to write a monthly column about it for the public record. The cultists tripped over their own song and solidified into a better choir by accident. The looters confessed and offered labor and water in exchange for a ledger note that said repaid. We fixed the future by making the past honest. The court issued a preliminary order on stewardship and corridors. They named the entity Doc 7 Ledger Saint until it chose a name. They declared Rael's Way a public right-of-way. They forbade callers. They demanded a board from crews, miners, teachers, and children. They scheduled maintenance feasts with banners that would make Karis cry laugh. They asked the fleet to draft the T protocol to keep them humble. They asked me if I would accept a temporary oath as steward, not owner, to keep the Saint's ledger from being smudged. I will accept an oath to a room, I said, to a desk, to soup, to children who count, not to a gun. The Scar Judge smiled with half a mouth. Accepted. The tender powered down its bracket and sent an officer with a stone polisher's hands to sit at a desk and try not to look like a dog who expected a boot and got a biscuit. The Seavast poured tea from a very old thermos into cups it didn't have yesterday. The Saint drew a little tea stain on the ledger page next to hearing, as if this were the proper format for law. Then the third escalation arrived without music, the way a knife enters a room, through someone who never saw the door open. A fast mover came off the dark side of a broken scaffold, its thermal profile minimal, its vector greedy. It wasn't with the fleet, or the cultists, or the looters. It wore no flag. It came straight for the dock throat with a payload small enough to be cheap and dirty enough to be ruin. Night choked one syllable. Projectile. Slug. No guidance. Minimal heat. 5 seconds. Zhao didn't swear. He moved. Coil cradle swung. Trigger locked. I could hear Karis's breath like a metronome hammered flat. The Saint did not blast or mirror or teach in this second. It did something so simple I almost laughed. It opened the classroom door. The slug hit air. Not much. Just a mouthful. Enough that its own heat rose as it carved. Enough that night could see it in full. Enough that the dock vent repurposed by 1,000 lessons to drink the heat of fools could swallow it like a mother takes a hot pan from a child's hands without making the child feel more foolish than necessary. The room shook hard enough that dust fell from a beam. The desks creaked and held. The soup recipe slid half an inch and stopped. When a weapon enters a school, every chair lifts its back. Cost night, said voice thin. Plate 5 again, duct 3. My left processing filament feels like a burnt tongue. Zhao. I said because orders let you not say feelings walk that vector back and find me a name. Karis, we don't tape plate 5 again. We rebuild it. Ask the Saint for a pattern. Savast, you will draft the public charge. The Sivast newly converted to the Church of Paperwork, with a soul snapped upright. On charge. Title Assault on a Public Classroom. Section Cowardice Tax. Penalty ledger debt payable in community hours or exile. The Saint wrote the pattern on the slate and added a margin note, temporary brace with soup pot lids if necessary. Karis laughed and then coughed and then laughed again. Zhao caught the vector, plotted the burn, and found a ghost freighter's child, someone who thought emptiness was an invisibility cloak, trying to slide away through the ring's shadow, with hands shaking on their sticks. Don't shoot, I said. and something in Zhao's throat unclenched. Open channel. Put them at a desk. The young voice filled the room, bravado falling off it like dust under rain. I didn't mean to, they lied badly. You meant to matter, I said. It's not the same. They started to cry, which made everyone's posture shift. The saint dimmed the lights, not like a theater, but like a house that knows when to make a room kind. Knight offered the back row a seat near the door. V. Sivast high on competence and T. Drafted an alternative penalty, 12 weeks of filter work and math tutoring, with a maintenance feast thrown in at week 6 if improvement justified cake. The court still on the slate signed with tidy initials. The child caught by kindness like a fish by clear water, accepted with a sob that sounded like a stone deciding to be a bridge. Kindness is a law when witnessed and signed. We rebuilt Plate 5 in 2 hours with the Saints pattern and a dozen soup pot lids loaned with honor by tank farmers and couriers. Karis burned the pads of 3 fingers and sucked on her teeth and insisted she liked the ache because it felt like something she chose. Zhao taught a quick class on momentum to 5 bored kids over a shaky video link and walked out of the room pale and triumphant, like a man who fought a bear and survived by telling it a story. Knight's scar from the subharmonic settled into a timbre that made it sound older in the best way. The Sivast taught T to fleet officers. The fleet officers made faces and then surprised themselves by enjoying being useful without being obeyed. The cultists painted a banner for the maintenance feast and pretended they didn't like the smell of fresh canvas. The convoy came on schedule, each ship announcing its child and its heat like a bow at a door. Rael's way held. The saint tuned the corridor like a harp. Knight monitored exhausts with the care of a baker. The court issued an interim order that would become a precedent. The tender dropped its bracket in a crate and put a plant in it instead. The saint finally chose its name. It wrote it on the slate in tidy letters and asked us not to be precious about it. Obsidian School. It drew a little eye with a laugh crease and then erased it, and drew a simpler eye because fashion changes. It put school plainly on a page that could have borne fortress or cathedral and did not. People will try to make your name bigger than your work. Resist. We drafted the doctrine in a spare hour inside a day that had fewer minutes than we needed and more tea than expected. Knight shaped the sentences like bread. The judges trimmed the crusts. The Sivast insisted on a clause about public chairs. Karis added the maintenance feast calendar. Zhao argued successfully for a column labeled "Regrets" that the saint demanded. The fleet contributed a note on audit mirrors that they pretended wasn't proud. We signed in this order children, minors, teachers, crews, legalists, judges, and then me last. Not because I mattered least, but because the room should outlive my name. The saint stamped it with its laugh-cut sigil not as a threat, but as an image people could hang in kitchens and offices without anyone thinking it should glow red. The following week was work in the way peace is work. We repainted blast scars. We rerouted vents. We held 2 maintenance feasts and made too many banners because everyone wanted to paint a little. The fleet left quietly, their tender lighter, and their faces less sharp. The cultists kept singing and managed to harmonize, which was a bigger miracle than the saint thought appropriate to note. Knight told me a joke so bad it hurt, and I loved it, because it meant the scar was a story, not a silence. Karis taught duct safety to children who copied her cusses twice and then agreed not to say them in front of their grandparents. Zhao started drawing stick buckets in the corners of maps. The Sivast wrote their first monthly column on lens polishing full of adjectives they didn't admit to owning last month. We had 2 more escalations before the formal hearing. One was a vendor who tried to sell us collars disguised as safety blankets. We wrapped hot soup in them and found they made fine potholders. The other was a politician who wanted to speak at our feast. We gave them a ladle and a rust brush, and they performed well enough to earn a seat. Costs were tangible and stubborn. Karis's fingers blistered and then healed into shiny places. Knight's timbre settled into a warm rasp that people liked, and it got embarrassed when told so. I cracked a molar on a stray stone in a pot of lentils and had to stand in a queue at the clinic with a miner and a courier and an old man from the banner committee who held my elbow when the pain made my vision bend. Pain shared in a line feels less like a verdict. The formal hearing 2 weeks after the day we opened the door was a pageant only in the sense that pages mattered. The judges spoke little. The people spoke enough. The doctrine was adopted and printed. It traveled on slates and shirts and mugs. The clause about regrets became popular. The clause about children signing first became law in 2 minor districts and a model elsewhere. The maintenance feast schedule became a gossip topic, as spicy as politics used to be before we remembered soup was louder than speeches when people were tired. The final act was quieter than anyone expected. We brought the Obsidian School's ledger to the public dock and watched as the first entries under the new statute blinked to life. A child's correction on a counting mistake in a convoy manifest. A fleet officer's admission that they enjoyed tea. A cultist's note that a banner looked better with fewer skulls. A miner's complaint about a squeaking vent resolved in an afternoon. A little cost line about Knight's new timbre and Zhao's stick buckets. A line about my tooth and the clinic queue and the old man's elbow. The judges asked me to speak before we closed the day. I did not want to. The room wanted something. I did what the room wanted. I put my palm on the desk's worn groove and felt every patient tap vibrate up my arm. I took a breath that made my ribs sound like someone else's house settling in a first winter in a long time. I looked at the slate and the sigil and Knight's humble icon and the faces beyond the glass and thought of the river lights and the boats that slowed when a lens cracked. My voice was a ledger entry and a recipe note. It didn't have to be beautiful. It had to be true. We were born noisy and hungry in a sky that does not care. We survived because we wrote down what saved us and taught it to each other without collars. We will lose patience and then find it again, and each time we will write down how. We will count what we save. We will confess when we fail. We will remember our schools before we remember our guns. We will polish lenses and issue tea. We will move heat without pretending it is guilt. We will build bridges out of desks and recipes and children's hands. We will make a law that sings because it is written and echoed and corrected until it feels like a lullaby. And when someone tries to shout us silent, we will show them a classroom and ask if they would like to sit. The sigil brightened, then cooled to a steady warm glow. On the ledger, a new entry blinked twice, then held, and the arrays along Dock 7 exhaled a breath you could see cooling in the thin sun, like a town's laundry on a line after rain. Schools before guns, ledgers before collars, witness before war.